Feel like he dresses like a randomized Sims 4 townie. I just
I'm Ava,
And I'm Isa. We're writers and fans.
and this is Unpacking the Plot.
Hello! Welcome to another episode. Last week we went over The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. If you haven't checked out that episode, had a good conversation there.
Yeah,
Ava,
I
what have you
enjoyed
been
them.
doing since then?
I actually just started watching a new show called Fire Country. Well, it's not a new show, it's new to me. I'm pretty invested, so I'm probably about 6 episodes in and just kind of getting a feel for it, checking it out.
Nice. I finally got a Marvel Unlimited subscription. They were having a really good deal, and so now I have a ton of access to Marvel comic books. So that's exciting.
I wish I could get more into comic books. I should really try out the subscription you've mentioned and how you can like view the panels one by one as opposed to being overwhelmed by the whole page.
Yeah, I mean, but I guess I had an advantage being able to comfortably read it because this week we're going to be talking about The Umbrella Academy.
Just season one.
Yeah, just season one. This will be a series, just like the show. Oh my gosh.
One episode per season, just so we can really dive deep and talk about these characters and these events without it feeling rushed, because I feel like our Bridgerton episode felt a little rushed, and I'd like to slow down the pace for this one. So, if you haven't heard of The Umbrella Academy, it is a TV show on Netflix. It is kind of like a sci-fi spectacular, if you will.
Mhm.
There's time travel, superheroes, dysfunctional family dynamics.
The show is based off of comics by Gerard Way, who, if you don't know, is the lead singer of the band My Chemical Romance. And I remember watching the first trailer of The Umbrella Academy when it was first coming out and seeing a thing being like, from Gerard Way. And I was like, I know that name. And I looked him up and I was like, oh, that's the guy from the My Chemical Romance thing. And weirdly enough, I didn't watch the show, but I got into the band. And it's weird. Every time we come on to this podcast, I like bring something up that makes it sound like I'm the millennial, and I'm not. Like my Buffy rewatch, it's like, no, I got into all this stuff late. I'm so late.
I am the millennial, and I was never a huge My Chemical Romance girl. I mean, I know a couple of their songs, but it was never music that I listened to. And I mean, I listened to Panic at the Disco and like similar bands,
Mhm.
but My Chemical Romance was just never it for me.
I went to the reunion tour in 2022. Um, so it's funny knowing about My Chemical Romance and their songs because I was reading issues of the Umbrella Academy, and one of them was titled after a lyric in one of their songs, and the creator thing being like, Gerard Way does this, this, and that, and he's been writing comics since this, and that. Oh, and he's also in a band, casually thrown in there at the end. And a lot of the designs and things like that remind me of designs for albums they've had. Like, I like seeing the little parallels and stuff. It's interesting. And I remember watching an interview of a long time ago where Gerard Way is like sketching out concept art of the characters. I think he was drawing Luther, one of the characters in there, because he had the ape body. And he was describing it kind of like X-Men. Someone asked him, it's like, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm just drawing comics. It's kind of like X-Men. I got that vibe when I first saw the trailer of the Umbrella Academy because, I mean, the older mentor guy takes in superpowered kids to his mansion is kind of X-Men-ish.
If Professor X was psychotic.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, when it comes to comics, the Umbrella Academy won an Eisner Award for its first volume, which is basically the Oscars for comic books. And honestly, the comics are very, very comic booky. If you want to know what a comic book is like, and you want the kooky, zany, weird, unexplained things that make a comic book, Umbrella Academy is where to go. Like, one of my biggest issues personally, I feel like modern comic books don't do this as much, but just throwing things at you with no explanation. I was reading it and it was like, and here's this, and here's that, and I don't know why it's here. It's just cool. And I'm like, does it have a purpose? And it was like, no, it's just fun and weird. Ultimately, I did enjoy the show explaining things more. I think it was a very good concept to be adapted. And I'll be making a lot more comparisons along the way. But one thing I really, really enjoyed was the diversity that was brought upon the show that the comic book lack. Because I really don't know how you sit down and are like, all these kids are from all over the world. And everyone is the same race? I mean, unless Reginald Hargreaves was a racist or something.
If he's like, for lack of a better word, sourcing these children from all over the world and they're all one race, that is totally unrealistic. But I could see him having some kind of underlying racist situation there.
Yeah, he kind of sucks, which we will get into. We will get into all that stuff. And speaking of getting into stuff, we're gonna dive into spoilers from here on out.
Because we're going to be diving into season one and really dissecting it and talking about our favorite moments. So the show starts off with a group of estranged siblings reuniting because their quote unquote father, billionaire inventor Reginald Hargreaves, died, and they're there for the funeral. I say quote unquote father because this is a man who, after a unprecedented supernatural event occurred where women all over the world mysteriously all became pregnant and delivered babies on the same day, having shown no signs of pregnancy prior to that, he goes and collects as many of these children as he can get his hands on. And he starts training up these itty bitty little superpowered children to fight the apocalypse. And he calls it the Umbrella Academy. Insert title here. But one of the siblings, number seven, because dear old dad doesn't give them names, he gives them numbers, is without powers. And so now these siblings who grew up with all kinds of trauma, they have to team up and stop the apocalypse.
Pretty much. I mean, their sibling five comes in and warns them that the apocalypse is coming because he's coming in from the future and tells them that's coming. And them being so estranged makes it a little difficult, especially when it turns out that number seven had powers all along and is the cause of the apocalypse, leading to the season's climax.
And it all takes place in an alternate universe where there is no technology, no cell phones, no computers. So there's no quick and easy way to say, hey, I found this out.
You know, in the comic books, it actually takes place a little differently because the characters were born in the 50s and then it's the like 70s, 80s. So that makes sense. But in the TV show, it's not the 80s,
Yeah, because the characters were born in 1989.
like Taylor Swift.
Every time I hear that year, I hear, and I was born in 1989.
So that is interesting that they decided to keep that same aesthetic despite it being modern day. They were like, oh, they just didn't go that much further with technology.
Well, because it would solve so many problems.
Speaking of, how did you feel about the general pacing and structure of the show before we really dive into it?
You know, I actually really liked the show. I liked a lot of stuff about it. There were a couple of things that got a little confusing, like the stop, rewind moments that they did with the time travel. The
Yeah.
first one was really cool, but I think they do it at least two times. They have at least a second one. I don't think that, I think it's just the two, right?
Yeah, my biggest one was the one where most of the episode isn't canonical because of the time travel jump. It was like, oh, well, there goes
Well,
all that.
yeah, that's the one that bothered me too. The first one didn't bother me. The first one was like, okay, I'm with this. But when they did the second one, it was like you had all these conversation, things were revealed. It's almost like you're sitting there trying to puzzle out what did happen, what these characters are aware of, and what the characters aren't aware of.
Hmm.
Whereas the first one was done well, like, okay, it's a reset, let's start over and do it again. Where the second one kind of left you like, wait, what?
It was sad seeing some things happen worse than they did in the erased timeline. So it was like, oh, well, everyone's sadder this time around, which isn't that much of a surprise. Like, being writers ourselves, we're gonna tend to put our characters through the ringer. So I get it. It's still frustrating as a viewer, though.
One thing I really loved about the show is how they use music. I love a show that uses music in like a comedic way and makes it so it's not just for the viewer, but it's actually happening to the characters. They really set the stage for it when all the siblings get together in their mansion and Luther, number one, puts on a song and for some reason it's heard throughout this entire mansion and all of the siblings, wherever they are throughout the house, start dancing to the music. And I really love how the camera pans out and you see the entire layout of the house almost as if it's a dollhouse. And you can see each sibling in each different part of the house dancing, which I'd like to take a moment to say in this massive house, just flashing the money around, these kids have the servants' quarters. The servants' quarters kitchen, the servants' quarters bedrooms. If that just isn't a peek into dear old dad's brain, what else is?
Yeah. And fun fact about the music, Gerard Way actually has a couple of songs sang for the show, and one of them is in season one. I think it's at the very end of the fifth episode.
There's three musical moments that really stood out to me. The first one was the scene that I just mentioned where they're all dancing in the house. Five's fight scene at the donut shop, and then the bowling alley fight scene. Those were the three that really stuck out to me as just like a hilarious use of music. And that's one thing that I really appreciate in TV shows.
One that got me was when it goes into Luther's flashback, number one, and it's playing One is the loneliest number.
Yeah, that one's funny too.
So we got to talk about how the season ended, which is that cliffhanger.
Watch out
That
for that cliff, y'all.
that makes me so glad that I didn't watch it when it first came out.
I
Like
did watch it when it first came out.
I went down the MCR rabbit hole instead of watching that show.
But what's hilarious, so season one and season two are rewatches for me. But funnily enough, I totally forgot almost half the stuff that happens in season one. But season two is stuck in my head pretty well for some reason. But even after having known what happens in season two, I still had to immediately watch the first episode of season two because of the cliffhanger.
I picked up one of the comic books as soon as I finished because I wanted to be fresh here, but I still wanted content. We will reunite and be on the same page very soon. Do not fret.
Just one episode. I'm very excited. And on that note, let's talk about our characters. We have seven siblings, and as previously stated, dear old dad, which I don't know why that's what I call him, but couldn't be bothered to give them names, so instead they have numbers. Later, their robot mother, yes, you heard that right, they have a robot mother, gave them names, some of them names. So we have number one.
Luther, otherwise known as Space Boy. I'm going to be bringing up all the little names as we go along with these little characters because in the comic books, they're mostly known by their little superhero names. So, number one is kind of the leader, which you can kind of guess from the name. He's pretty loyal and he has super strength. Ava, you want to go ahead and cover number two, who's for some reason his name is Kraken. I don't know where that, even in the comic book, is still completely lost to me.
Number two, Diego. He is a rebellious vigilante with the ability of trajectory manipulation, and that means he can curve anything he throws, which is typically a knife. He has authority issues, but also wants to prove himself and often comes to heads with number one. And that brings us to number three.
Allison, the rumor. She, in the show, is an actress. In the comic books, she is an divorcee who is a mom, and that is also the case in the show. And she has this kind of compulsion, reality altering power where she says, I heard a rumor when she starts off her sentences, and whatever she says next makes it come true. And she has this close relationship with number one.
A little too close. Number four, Klaus, or
The seance.
well, he's an addict, but he's hilarious,
We love
and
Klaus.
we love Klaus.
We're basic like that.
He he is just this big bundle of childhood trauma, and his ability is that he can see the dead.
Now I shall talk about number five, who did not get a name from their robot mom because he left kind of early. He got carried away time traveling and he was lost for a long time. He is just five. That is his name. And so he is a 60-year-old man, 58 in the show, stuck in a 13-year-old in the show, 10-year-old in the comic, stuck in a child's body, basically, because something went wrong with the time travel. And so he's very pragmatic, he is very smart, and he is basically fixated on stopping the apocalypse because that has been his mindset for decades. And he's also a very efficient killer. And he has spatial jump powers, basically, that he can push into time travel if he wants.
And that brings us to number six, Ben, aka the Horror. He's a ghost. Only Klaus can see him. He can sprout these weird tentacles from his chest, kind of wiggles around and kills people.
Yeah, in both the comic and the show, it looks like he's not comfortable. He's like, I mean, I'm doing it because I have to, but I'm not very okay with being like this.
Yeah, 4 and 6, they got it rough with the powers. And that brings us to
Number seven, who we will be referring to as number seven because I'm sure most people listening know about Elliot Page's transition and that he is in this show because that was one of the first things about the Umbrella Academy I noticed. I was like, oh, I know that actor. So we will be referring to the character as number seven as we go on because that is the consistent name throughout both the show and the comic book because we have the comic books as well to discuss number seven. But in season one, they are called Vanya, just to clarify for those who've seen season one. In the comic books, they are called the White Violin, and number seven's very isolated from the family because it's believed that they don't have any powers. Turns out they do, and they can manipulate sound waves into force, and
uh,
it's very destructive.
do you think that they're based off of Jean Grey a little bit?
I wouldn't be surprised. Gerard Way based it off X-Men.
I just want to give them a hug.
X-Men.
Number 7 has it rough. And now for the fun part, the character deep dive. Isa, do you want to get started with 5?
Sure, yeah. Five kind of kicks off the inciting incident for our characters. I mean, yeah, technically it's the whole dead dad thing, but the apocalypse stuff and trying to save the world together wouldn't have happened without Five just magically showing up from the future. Something I really like that they changed was the mystery of it because in the comic books we see flash forwards of Five in the future as an old man and we see him coming back in his younger child body. But in the show, where everyone's like, "Where's Five? Oh, it's been so long since he's been missing." And then he shows up in this creepy time warp thing, and he's back, and he's like, "Hey, the apocalypse is coming, and I'm stuck in my 13-year-old body, and I'm 58."
I did really like the way they did that, how they had the scene where it takes place at the father's funeral, and all of a sudden this big portal opens up and you see the face of this old man, and they're like, "What's going on?" And then slowly the face like ages down and it becomes their brother who went missing, and he falls through and he's just like, "Ah, shit." It just really kind of sets the tone for his character because 5 is just great. And he's this sarcastic old man who has lived alone in the apocalypse. He, as we mentioned previously, he's a character that can jump through time and space. He found himself arriving the day after the apocalypse and finding all of his siblings dead, and then spent the rest of his adult years by himself with only Dolores to keep him company. And Dolores is a mannequin.
It's kind of sad thinking about how this boy grew up in the apocalypse all by himself and he gets attached to a mannequin, especially like how it really shows how awkward he is. Because I feel like in the comic, he's kind of just this posh old man who's more educated than everyone. Whereas in the show, it's like he's this grouchy old man who's been alone and doesn't really know how to socialize because he didn't really start hanging out with people till he got recruited by that crazy time agency when he was already pretty old.
Yeah, he was well into his probably 50s when they recruited him. One thing that I do think is funny is they say we all marry one of our parents, right? And 5 chose Dolores. I mean, granted, it was his only option in the post-apocalyptic world he found himself in, but his life partner is a mannequin and his mother was a robot.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting parallel.
You know, as jaded as Five is, something I really liked about him was how dedicated he was to the family. Because the last time he saw his siblings were when they were all united and together before all the estrangement began. And I really like seeing that you could really rely on the character because it was clear how attached he was to his family and stopping the apocalypse.
I think part of that is kind of a theme that you see throughout media is some one person trying so hard to claw their way back to something only for it to no longer even exist. And you kind of see that, well, what am I fighting for? And then just this whole drive where he's still fighting for them. Throughout his plot line, it's always, what about my family? That is his drive.
Yeah, there's always this back and forth between him and the time agency.
The Commission, one of our antagonists throughout the first season.
Yeah, tries to re-recruit him after he was basically an assassin for them for a while. And then, of course, they send assassins after him because he broke the contract a little early by going back in time to try to stop the apocalypse with his family.
Yeah, he was with them for less than 5 years because his contract was for 5 years of service. So
Yep. And go back, which if he could go back to any time anyway, you would think that he would have just waited till the contract was up, but whatever.
I know, right?
Like it
It
wasn't
is
gonna
what
not be there. But can we talk about Klaus?
I love Klaus. When we open on Klaus, he's actually just getting out of rehab and then immediately going out and relapsing. And we find him in an ambulance being revived and then learning of his father's death. And so we follow him on this journey of being in the pits of his addiction, which is also fueled by his ability to see ghosts and commune with spirits. And so he fights to get sober so that he can use his ability, but then also he relapses into substance use in order to block out his abilities. So it's this I need to use my abilities to help my family, but at the same time, I want nothing to do with it.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't help when your dad put you in a crypt and forced you to commune with dead people as a child. There can't be anything comfortable about seeing dead people. I like how the show conveys that. It's like, this is not a fun power at all. This is random people showing up and talking to you whenever and invading your space. You don't really get a moment's time alone.
Klaus is never alone because the spirit of their deceased sibling Ben is always with him. Even when he is high on substances, he can still see Ben.
I like how the show just goes to convey how strong Klaus's powers can be when he is sober. And that especially shows when he's able to, I don't know, force Ben to light and make him interact with the environment up to the point where towards the end he helps them all in the climax and everyone's able to see him. I love those little moments between him and Ben too. There's one moment that stuck out to me the most, and it's when Klaus is getting tortured by the assassins that are trailing Five. And Ben, I mean, it's telling the audience, but when else are you gonna do it? You know, he just straight up says, like, real torture is watching your sibling throw his life away with drugs. And the actual quote is like, piss his life away because Ben's dead. He's just watching Klaus basically kill himself all the time, every day.
My favorite moment between the two is actually the scene where Klaus is about to relapse and he takes the pill and he puts it in his mouth, and then Ben swings and actually lands a punch on Klaus, which Ben can't do that without Klaus making it happen. So it's the internal battle of Klaus fighting against himself, stay sober, relapse. And so, on some level, he wanted Ben to stop him. So he was able to use his powers in a way he had never had before and didn't even know he could do. And Ben landed that punch and kept Klaus sober in that moment. And I thought that that was really a great moment between the two of them.
Yeah, Ben is kind of the angel on Klaus's shoulder.
And then going back to your torture scene, I think it's just really fitting for Klaus's personality that they're like trying to strangle him and torture him. And then he's like getting off and makes Cha Cha and Hazel, who are the two that are torturing him, it's so uncomfortable that they stop torturing him. And then he does it again when they try to waterboard him by pouring water onto his face as opposed to shoving his face into water. And he just sits there and like drinks it. And then he's like, oh, thank you. I was so parched.
Yeah,
And
he
I'm like,
gargles it to stop the drowning. I
yeah.
was like, huh, I never thought about that.
Another moment that I really enjoy is where Luther is trying to get to the bottom of the father's death, and he's over here essentially accusing the siblings. And Clem goes with his sarcasm, I'm just going to go murder mom. And then about an episode later, Diego does end up murdering their mom.
It is Klaus that ends up finding out that the dad actually killed himself, and that was the whole. The dad wanted everyone to get together. Reginald Hargreaves was just like, you know what? My kids are all estranged. Let me just die, and now everyone will show up.
He definitely went about it the wrong way, but maybe that's why he was so hard on Klaus. Maybe he knew that Klaus was going to be the one to fill in all these blanks because he was putting Klaus through hell so that Klaus could keep him alive after he died.
I agree. The first thing he says to him when he sees him in the afterlife is like, my son who could see the dead should have summoned me by now. And that was when Klaus was going to see his dead boyfriend that he met when he got magically teleported to Vietnam and was stuck in the war and got just trauma for 10 months.
Yeah. The insta trauma because poor Klaus did not have enough trauma in his life between his
Yeah.
childhood trauma and then, he's fresh out just escaping from having been tortured and watching the person who rescued him die. He just is on a bus and randomly, boom, now you're in Nam. Go get some more trauma.
A lot of big implications for Klaus's powers, though, so I'm excited to see him moving forward.
Yeah, me too.
One thing, though, I feel like he dresses like a randomized Sims 4 townie. I just,
I really like the scene when Allison's like, "Is that my skirt?" He's like, "Yeah." And he just like, what does he say?
it's breezy on the bits.
It's breezy on the bits. Yeah. It's like, "Oh,
Yeah.
Klaus."
Something that bugged me was when Klaus is freed from being tortured and he escapes and he doesn't warn Detective Patch, who's the one who comes and saves him, that there's two people there. He's seen the one
Oh, yeah,
person.
for sure.
I was like, what? So you got his brother Diego coming in, seeing her dead body, and it's like, what?
She literally says to him, "Are you Diego's brother?" And he's like, "Yeah." So obviously he knows that this person knows his brother. There's some kind of relationship there. And he's just like, "I'm good. I've been fight trained since I was born. Just let me get out of here." Speaking of Detective Patch, Diego, aka number two. His vigilante persona is really highlighted in the first episode because the inciting incident is the father passing away. And so we see each of the siblings learning the news of their father passing away. And so
Right.
it kind of gives us the glimpse into their ordinary life before their life is upended by the inciting incident. And so he is in the middle of a home invasion and he takes out all of the criminals that are invading the home. And then you zoom in on the family as they're bound and gagged. Diego's like watching the news, finding out his father died, and he just goes, "I took care of the bad guys for you. Get yourself out of that." I feel like that's a good indicator of his personality.
He is basically trying to be Batman.
I was just thinking Batman.
In the comic books, he gives off more of Batman, maybe more Rorschach than Batman. Like, Rorschach from Watchmen is just crazy Batman who is not rich and is trying to be all mysterious and vigilante. And that's basically Diego on a tamer version, which would make sense because Gerard Way was a big Watchmen person as well. So.
Yeah, I feel like he's really struggling to find himself, and he just seems to not be able to find what works for him. He's stuck in the past of wanting to be the hero that he was trained to be. It kind of delves into his backstory a little bit that he was in the police academy with Detective Patch, but seems like he couldn't conform to the rules and was kicked out for going his own way in his vigilante tendencies. So you kind of see him struggling with that. He works at a boxing gym, sweeping the floors in order to have room and board in a back room there. So he just seems like a very lost character. You see him have a really strong relationship with Robot Mom, Grace, and she was really there for him. She helped him overcome a speech impediment, and he struggles with seeing her faltering in her programming and ultimately makes the decision to shut down the robot.
She comes
And
back later. In the comic books, he is the most apathetic towards the entire family. He is basically just Batmaning around and he's least attached. So I enjoyed how in the show they gave him attachments.
Patch was an interesting attachment because, there's obviously the implied romantic history between them, judging by the way they interact and the way he goes to her when Grace passes away, and the way that she can't condone his actions, but she's still supportive of him in what way she can be. It seems like there were real feelings there. It wasn't just like a casual romantic relationship. Really, the only attachments you see Diego have are Patch and Grace. He doesn't really seem to have much to care or say about the rest of his family, even being so far as to get annoyed when Klaus wants to tag along with him.
They had great interactions. I like how he stuck up for him when Klaus went to the bar of Vietnam veterans and
Yeah.
they're about to beat him up because he was too young of a man to be a Vietnam veteran.
Yeah, I liked that scene too. It is funny, with all of his detachment, he is the one that seems to stand up for his siblings. He also stands up for Seven.
It's kind of
Mm.
a no one messes with my siblings except for me kind of vibe.
Yeah.
And his arc kind of becomes intertwined with the others when Patch is killed by Hazel and Cha-Cha, the assassins that are after 5, and he wants to kill them, and he decides not to towards the end. Hazel kind of turns over a new leaf because Hazel's like, I don't want to be an assassin and work for the commission anymore,
As
kind
he
of.
falls in love.
He does. Hazel gives 5 these guns with prints on them to help
Yes.
prove Diego's innocence because the police force think that Diego killed Patch because, of course, but at the end, Diego refuses to kill Cha-Cha when he has her, which I don't know how I feel about that.
Five made the comment, how would your friend feel about the fact that you are on this vigilante revenge mission? And so I think he kind of does that to honor Patch because Patch wouldn't have done it. I don't think he does it really for any reason for himself. I think he doesn't want to kill somebody in her name. I think it's
Yeah.
kind of like him honoring her
I understood the
because
reasoning. They do that all the time in TV shows. I just thought this one would break the cycle.
I think he had said to her, can't you just try it my way this one time? And she did, and she died.
Oh, and so then he was doing it her way. Okay, you know what? You've convinced me. But this really did feel like a show where they would have tried to change that cliche.
I don't know. I feel like it worked for me. I wasn't looking for Cha Cha to live, but then again, Cha Cha really doesn't live because the apocalypse takes her out. But I think it was kind of fitting in terms of her character.
Diego's kind of always
Who
fighting to be leader when the actual leader, as dubbed by their father, is Luther, number 1. And do you think they were named that way on purpose by order of importance to him?
I don't know if it was order of importance or if it was order of acquisition. Like what made Luther number one? Is it just a chance?
Maybe being number 1, being called that kind of added to Luther's whole extreme loyalty and need to have this life as a hero and be a superhero and save the world and all that because he was probably viewing the numbers as ranking of sorts. I mean, he was the leader and then he stayed with Reginald Hargreaves, their dad, the longest compared to everyone else, up to the point where it cost him. And there was a mission, at least in the show, where he got so horribly injured that they used a serum that combined some, I think, ape DNA of sorts, and he was forever altered. And it's all really shows in his upper body as opposed to the rest of him. As far as I know, I mean, we don't see anything else, but that made me lose my train of thought. Give me a second.
Well, I'll jump off of your earlier point. Being number one is Luther's entire personality to me.
Yeah.
He pushes things away because he feels like he needs to do things for the family. He feels like he needs to follow his dad's orders, stay in line. He needs to be the second in command to his father's command. And it's just, I mean, I think he actually says to Diego at one point, you're not number one, I am.
Yeah, they do butt heads a lot, but there is a because the thing is like Diego's gone out and tried to make a name for himself and use his skills outside of the family and make it worth something, whereas Luther is so in his head about doing things for his dad up to the point where he's like, "Oh, dad must have sent me to the moon." And it probably has something to do with the apocalypse. There's probably a reason for it. And then, oh no, dad didn't read any of my correspondence from the moon. He just sent me there because he was ashamed after he made me part ape, which in the comic books, it happens when he's a lot younger and his head is transplanted onto an ape body and he's not wearing clothes over it. I really prefer how in this show it's kind of a mystery, how it takes little things from the comics and adds suspense. I both love and hate when we see the flashback of him waking up to his changed body and there's a monkey Jack in the Box. I was like horrified with him. Like I hate the idea of like your body changing and not recognizing it, like up to the point where what happens with his sister Allison later and he's like by her bedside, like your body's gonna change. I'm not gonna let you wake up alone. That was hitting me too hard.
Listening to you say his sister Allison, and I was literally sitting here thinking about their relationship because they have a unique relationship.
I still can't wrap my head around whether or not they're technically related, whatever impregnated those women all over the world. But anyway, Luther is so isolated where he hasn't gone out and done things. And that's what's crazy is like we have other characters like number 7 who were genuinely isolated. And then we had who should have had the most free reign isolating himself. Luther just kept doing that to himself. There was no need to stick around with the family or his dad as long as he did and be so loyal, but he kept doing it. And he was sent to the moon for 4 years and was in isolation over there as well. Whereas in the comic book, he is a little boy and he looks up at the moon and he's like, Dad, I want to go to the moon. And it's like this nice thing. And then going to the moon back and forth is what kind of causes the accident. And also why he has the name Space Boy. In the TV show, he's called Space Boy, and there's no reason because he hasn't gone to the moon yet. But I don't know. There's a lot of actions he takes that are like, not cool, but I feel bad for him. He doesn't know any better because he's so gung-ho on the loyalty and being a hero. I think his arc is about breaking that mentality, arguably.
I don't know. We're big on talking about like things you can't get past, like actions you can't get past that a character's done. And for me, his treatment of Seven is something that's hard for me to get past. There's no attempting to give the benefit of the doubt. It's immediately like Seven looking to find out what happened to Allison after the altercation between them, which we'll get into in a bit, and just relieved to find comfort only for their brother to put them in a headlock and choke them out. Just the constant betrayal that Seven must feeling. His betrayal of Seven and his treatment of Seven. I understand that the situation was dire, but just the way he treated Seven in those moments is hard for me to get over.
Yeah, he stopped seeing Seven as a person. He started seeing Seven as a thing to stop, a mission, because that's what he kept latching onto. He's like, I need to be a hero. I need to be. It's not good, but
Yeah,
I
it's
feel
like
like every action that any of these characters took was conveyed really well to where I was like, makes sense. Do I agree? No, not as people, but makes sense for character. Ultimately, Luther's closest relationship is with Allison, number three. And with Allison, she actually leaves the academy just like everyone else did around, I think it's their late teens. And she gets married, she has a kid, and she's also built up this actress career, which she has this question brought to her, which is like, is her life real? Because her power is all about altering that reality, altering life, which is such an interesting question of ethics to bring up. And I'm glad that that character is confronted with that in the show.
Well, I feel like the most crucial part is you realize that these characters have had their powers from an extremely young age. In flashbacks, we see these characters as young as 4 years old, using the power and knowing how to use it. So clearly they've had it for a decent amount of time at that point, and they're only four. Their brains aren't completely developed. So at a very young age, all she had to do was say, I heard a rumor, and get whatever she wanted in life. She didn't really come to terms with how wrong using her power could be until she used it against her own daughter. And that's a huge plot point for her, is this guilt that she carries because her daughter was asking for a billion stories, was essentially fighting bedtime. And she turned to her and said, I heard a rumor that you were really tired and fell right to sleep. And then, boom, her daughter goes to sleep. But she took away her daughter's autonomy. Her husband sees, and it, assuming that that was the catalyst that started the divorce that we see about throughout the season, as well as the fact that she no longer has custody of her daughter and hasn't seen her. That's kind of her turning point, because when we see her in the show, she doesn't use her power anymore. And that's the reason why.
Yeah, Allison questions a lot about her life. And in the show, there's a moment when she is driving and contemplating so many different things about her power and what she said and done and used it for. And there is a moment where you overhear her voice saying, I heard a rumor that you love me. And that is ripped straight from the comic book. It is indeed told to her husband. Allison is now divorced to. And yes, she basically does avoid using her power. And then she can't, even if she wanted to, because number seven slashes her throat with the violin and she is unable to speak. They all think that the apocalypse is coming and they might not be able to stop it. And so she tries to call her daughter and has to have Luther get that message across to her.
It was not Seven's intention to slash her throat, but Seven had just found out that at a young age, Allison had used her powers against them and was afraid that they were about to do it again. And they
Yeah.
reacted with a power that they couldn't control.
After number seven accidentally slashes Allison's throat, I liked how all the boys immediately were like, I'll donate the blood, like when they needed to donate blood to her. I love that. Towards the end of the show, they really were uniting, except, of course, poor number seven. But Allison, even after the throat slash, was very forgiving, unlike in the comic.
Well, I think that that's also because Allison's learning the consequences of her power. And I think in that moment, she was about to rumor Seven again.
Yeah, I think so too.
And
It was
so,
scary. What else? Like, that's her only defense.
yeah. And I mean, she's taking away somebody's autonomy. and literally
Yeah.
controlling the puppet strings. And if somebody's about to do that to you, you're going to react. I think in that moment she was forgiving of Seven because she wants to be forgiven for what she did to her daughter, as well as finally understanding what it is that her power does to somebody.
I like that change. I like that Seven and Allison had a connection in the show, whereas in the comic book, Seven is completely detached from everyone. And when Seven tries to get involved, Diego's like, ugh, I hate what you did and wrote that book about us. Ugh. And then Seven's like, fuck my family. I'm gonna join the bad guys. And then becomes evil and goes to destroy the world. Because the powers for Seven are awakened by this evil orchestra that ties them up to tubes and things and unlocks the power.
I liked that Seven's powers weren't really awakened. It was more that they stopped being repressed. So we start off with Seven, who is completely isolated from their entire family. They were always the sibling that didn't have powers in a family of superheroes. They were just the ordinary one. And that is the constant line that is said to them throughout the season. And
And that happened because Allison used her rumor powers on them.
I think yes and no, because, well, Allison was told to do that by the father. And so that was the
Yeah.
father's word. That was the father's way of breaking Seven's spirit. You're ordinary. So he told Allison to say that. They were only 4 at the time. And that made Seven, granted 4 years old, completely forget that they ever had powers to begin with. And then the father begins medicating them and puts them on what can only be described as some kind of blocker because as we see Seven, they're very numb until they start to wean off the medication and they start to have feelings. There starts to be this like repressed rage coming out.
Right, right.
Seven wrote a book as an expose on the family and kind of talked about their life as number 7, which I also thought was really sad in that the book didn't do very well.
You know, Seven's arc is kind of interesting because it's Allison that's the catalyst to making them decide they're going to connect with people better. And then that leaves them open to the manipulation of this murderer named Leonard. He does not exist in the comic book. Like I said, it's this weird, crazy orchestra. Instead, the orchestra for Dampton. It's a death cult, and that means damned in German, apparently. And they want to cause the apocalypse. But from the get-go, I knew this person was up to no good. There's something that was gonna turn number 7 to the dark side.
Can I say something funny? This was a
Sure.
rewatch for me. I completely forgot that Leonard existed. Cue Taylor Swift song.
He was just the catalyst, ultimately. I thought it was interesting, though, his connection with them, but
I think it's also just so sad to see how easy it was for him to connect with Seven because Seven was so isolated and just wanted to be heard and just wanted to feel special. And so this guy was easily able to maneuver in and manipulate them because they had been seeking that connection. Seven makes me so sad.
7 is a sad story. It's not hard to empathize when we see them on a rampage ready to destroy the world until, of course, it seems like Allison gets through to them. And then, of course, the rest of the siblings are like, attack! And oops. The show really made it seem like if it weren't for that, the apocalypse wouldn't have happened. The comic made it inevitable when they tried. Like, that was Seven's goal,
In the show,
no
it
matter
seems
what.
more like the constant betrayal is what pushes Seven. And now they are feeling things fully, and they have these powers that they're trying to contend with. And the powers are so tied to their emotions that when they feel that betrayal, when Allison was trying to break them apart from Leonard, even though Allison was right and had their best interests at heart, they couldn't see that because finally they had somebody that made them feel special. Again, you have it when they're excited about their concert and this achievement that they've gotten because they finally made first chair in the orchestra. And they show up at the house and there's a family meeting that they weren't even thought to be invited to because, again, they're the ordinary sibling without powers. And then you have Allison shows up. They have the confrontation about Leonard, and Seven finds out that Allison had rumored them as a child to make them forget that there was anything special about them. And, Seven feels this sense of betrayal with, you ruined my entire life. You made me feel like I was nothing. And then Allison goes to rumor Seven again because they're afraid. and then ends up lashing out and slitting Allison's throat. And they think that they killed their sister. Then Leonard shows up and takes Seven back to his house. And then Seven finds out what Leonard's really been up to and that Allison was right all along. And they kick his ass and then show up at home because they don't want to be this evil force. They want to be part of their family. They want to fix things. And Luther immediately puts them in a headlock under the guise of hugging them and comforting them. And then waking up, shoved in this room that is the essence of all of their childhood trauma. And they can't hear what's going on outside. So they can't hear what siblings are fighting for them and what siblings think they should stay in there. Everybody is standing up for them except for Luther. But Luther's the strongest and they can't get past him, but they also don't try very hard. And it's just betrayal, betrayal, betrayal.
Yeah. I mean, yes, it was the betrayal that set them off. What I'm saying is that the comic book made it seem like their goal was always going to be, let me destroy the world. Because I started destroying the world's going to end anyway. And it was more about the isolation and rejection, less about the betrayal. Whereas the show was like, we got to give him as much reason as possible to do this. And then the destruction of the world happened by accident. The apocalypse. It was like, oops,
Yeah.
I shot a laser into the moon. And if you guys hadn't tackled me or tried to tackle me, then the end of the world wouldn't have happened. But I do think it was smart to connect the characters' motivations with something as huge as wanting to destroy the world. Whereas in the comic book, it seemed, yes, kind of like that, but also on a more meta level, like you are part of this team full of heroes and you're the villain because you've never truly been a part of that team. You've always been the outcast. And that's the case with Seven. And I still think we get that in the show, but in the show, we also get all those extra layers instead of rejection, outcast. It was all those extra moments of betrayal. And I think that really added to the story of Umbrella Academy in general because the comic books definitely made me feel like this was something worth fleshing out. So I'm glad the show exists and does that, even if it diverges very, very much from the source material. One thing I feel like diverges a lot from the comics is when Seven kills Pogo, their little chimp butler. In the show, he knows about all the drugs and what Hargreaves did to keep Seven repressed. Whereas in the comic, Pogo was one of Seven's few supporters and comforted them whenever they felt like they were less than. However, in the comic book, Seven literally explodes his brain. And in the show, he kind of deserved the brain explosion, but Seven just gives him a, impaled death. Very calm comparison.
You feel like the show, well, and the comic book itself, it just kind of is like well, it's sci-fi. I want a robot mom doing it. I want a chimpanzee butler doing it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what the comic was doing a lot, which is why the Umbrella Academy has so many unanswered questions. Like, why are all these pregnant women suddenly around the world with no sign of pregnancy before? Why? It's just cool. It's interesting. How else are these superheroes gonna come to be? And then you watch it in the show and it's like, ooh, this is kind of messed up. Because it just kind of narrates it in the comic, and it's like, I don't know if this is cool anymore.
Yeah, that it's definitely something that I can't wait to see if they explore a little bit more, the backstory behind the spontaneous pregnancies.
Yeah, I think the show goes into reasons and drops more hints, which I really like. I'm wondering about the other 34 children. That's like a lot of people. Did they all have powers? Did some of them die? Are some of them raised? Like, I have so many questions, especially after season one. And I feel like this episode that we're doing right now is like season one, sort of a foundation for the rest of the seasons moving forward. Because I definitely want to dive more into the comics later on.
Yeah, I think that that is something that could be answered in the later seasons a little bit. So it doesn't bother me too much that it's missing right now because it kind of keeps me wanting to tune in and find out.
Something that I prefer though in the show is I feel like there are more inklings and hints and seeds to explore and build upon, as opposed to the comic, like you were saying earlier, it's like cool thing, here's another cool thing. And then the show was like, cool thing, and here's this other little thing that could mean something else. Like those little like things that came out of the jar, the little glowy things at the end of season one.
That totally was another one of those moments that skipped my mind when I watched the season originally. But during my rewatch, I was like, none of this fits in with anything.
Yeah, it's Hargreaves sitting down with this woman that he loves that's dying, whose violin he gives to Seven later on. But it's such a weird scenery. Like he opens the window and it doesn't look real. I mean, it probably isn't, it's CGI, but and then he lets these little glowy thingies out of a jar and and my theory is that those are some sort of things that went out into the world and impregnated all those women. I mean, they do kind of look like glowy little sperm thingies. I don't know. But that was like a seed that was planted that hinted towards something.
Yeah, I feel like season one was a really great introduction to all these characters.
Mhm.
Like, I feel like you really got to know the characters and their backgrounds and the storyline, and they did it in a way that had a cohesive plot. So I feel like going forward in more seasons, we're going to get more of the backstory and a little more world building. Because season one feels they're in their own bubble. Even Allison's families talked about, you see them in flashbacks, but everything happens in this bubble that takes place in the city that they're in, and it just feels very localized.
You know, there is something I wanted to bring up. In the comic books, Hazel and Cha-Cha are not developed. They're just kind of sugar addicted assassins. And in the show, they have these whole arcs. They're basically the B plot. And it's like, maybe we didn't need this. I mean, I liked diving into the other characters a lot, but I'm not sure if we needed to dive into the assassins that much.
Did you feel like there was a little unrequited romance between Hazel and Cha-Cha?
Yes.
There's that scene where Hazel's like, we could get out, and Cha-Cha thinks that she seems to think that he wants to like start a life with her, and he's with Agnes. And she's like, you son of a bitch. And then she decides to kill him after all. I was like, oh, look at you harboring feelings for your partner.
I can appreciate when a show looks at the source material and works with what they have and goes, let's build and expand upon it. But I feel like the Umbrella Academy was definitely something to build and expand on, but they needed to pick their battles and they picked all the battles.
Yeah, I think it's important when something is developing from source material that has a fan base that you kind of try to fill in the blanks that leave questions unanswered. You see a lot of times when people make movies from books, people are all upset that stuff is missing from the movie. But I think with a TV show, you have a unique opportunity to really dive deep and kind of flesh out more of what people are looking for and kind of answer some questions. And I think that's something that, based on what you're saying, that the Umbrella Academy did pretty well.
Yeah, I really do think they did. I rather have more content than less, if I'm being honest. I like being spoiled in my TV shows, as in getting a lot of things, not being told what happens. I want to say one thing about the Umbrella Academy that I thought was an interesting change because they kept hyping up Klaus's powers, and in the comic book, Klaus stops the apocalypse. Like we just see him holding his hand out when the moon asteroid comes, and then the apocalypse is stopped. And it's like, oh wow, you did it. And he's like the savior of the world in the next couple volumes. But in the show, it was like, oh shit, we gotta get out of here. Five, let's just time travel to another part of the world.
I really like Klaus's character, and I'm really excited to see his development in the upcoming seasons.
It's crazy. Like I just know that I would be choosing favorites a lot easier if I'd watched this show when it came out. But I'm watching this now and I'm like, I like all of you. Some of you suck sometimes, but I like you all.
I like most of the characters. I think Klaus and Five are the most fun to watch on screen. I do struggle with Luther and Allison a little bit, though. Luther's behavior towards Seven is really hard for me to get over.
We will see
Then
how that's all addressed in the next season, I hope. Because now it's not just comic book answers they need to give us and uphold and adapt. It's this new world they created with their own adaptation moving forward.
I'm excited for our next episode, which will be on season two.
We'll definitely be sprinkling in some other episodes throughout our little Umbrella Academy series while watching the Umbrella Academy series. But anyway, You can follow Unpacking the Plot Pod at Instagram, TikTok, subscribe on YouTube, all that jazz. Listen wherever you want. And yeah,
I'm Ava.
and I'm Isa.
Thank you for unpacking the plot with us. Bye.
Bye.